Hello, my name is Jason Littlefield, and I am the Executive Director of Empowered Pathways. From 2014 to 2021, I was a public school social and emotional learning specialist in Austin, Texas. In that role, I provided professional development, coaching, and curriculum development in self awareness, self management, social awareness, relationship building, and decision making skills. Around 2017, 2018, my work began to evolve into the diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti racism realms. This is when I first understood the words diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti racism were not being interpreted and used to increase our sense of well being and belonging, but instead a political narrative objective. And not a small objective, but a complete undoing and reversal of the classical liberal Enlightenment era of human history. I spent the next 4 years attempting to engage in professional conversations because I also noticed applying these new theory and practices is decreasing our senses of well being and belonging. These attempted conversations resulted in me being gaslit, excluded, and isolated from my working peers. So I was also able to study the impact the new ideology is having on friendships, working groups, creativity, and innovation. I also studied the historical origins of these ideas and what happens to societies when they become the dominant cultural and political authority. While studying this phenomena, I also began developing and curating a set of attitudes and practices I now call empowered humanity theory to counter the destructiveness I was seeing. In this brief presentation, I'd like to help us all better understand this moment in time and offer a solution so that we can ascend beyond our current chaos and division. So perhaps the past few years have felt maybe a little off. So you are here. Kidding aside, um, have you noticed this constant cynical criticism and no real solutions and a constant changing and evolving language and rules and intensified acts of violence and discrimination against each other? Well, regarding the cynical criticism, this comes from the 1937 idea of critical theory, which was an idea purposed to erode classical liberal societies. Regarding the constant confusion and rule changes, a key feature of revolution is for there to never be a status quo and constantly disrupt and constantly dismantle. And the prejudice, aggression, and cruelty, this is attributed to our prioritizing the group over the individual. And this is where capacities of prejudice, aggression, and cruelty are strengthened in our psychological levels. What I've noticed is that what we are experiencing in society and even within ourselves to a degree is the impact of competing worldviews and the emergence of a new culture. Culture can be defined as the underlying and overt, written and unwritten rules that guide and govern a group, society, and even state. While this clash has been at play for ages, around the late 1960s was a heavy acceleration period, and then from 2017 onward, the new ideology has begun taking root in all of our institutions and starting to emerge as societal norms. The clashing cultures I'm referring to are basic liberalism and the emerging successor ideology. Key ideas from liberalism include the sovereign individual and their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, logic and rational thinking, the scientific method, individuality and the awareness of others' individuality, and the pursuit of virtues, truth, beauty, and goodness. Key ideas from the successor ideology include critical theory as a solution finding tool. Social advancement and rewards, punishments, incentives are determined by biological traits and sexual identities, along with the stereotypes that accompany them, and constant deconstructing and pursuing equal life outcomes for all members of society. My experience and research shows that present day framing of diversity, equity, inclusion, anti racism, and social and emotional learning, or SEL, are all rooted in successor ideology rather than Enlightenment era liberalism. And before we continue advancing these ideas, I think we owe it not only to this present moment, but to future generations to pause and inspect the intent and impact of these ideas, and then proceed advancing them, understanding what they are doing, or find a different set of ideas. Pay attention to the bullets here because you'll see them again in a couple of slides. Liberalism claims the individual has inalienable rights, and the successor ideology views the individual as the source of racism, bigotry, and injustice, and prioritizes a group identity over the individual. With successor ideology, all individuals are absorbed into a group and given the identity markers of oppressed or oppressor. With this system, groups have different values. They see others as different, and a sense of belonging is determined by the identity group. And then because of this, the groups discriminate against each other. Positive psychology is the scientific study of human flourishing and an applied approach to optimal functioning. And the Positive Psychology Center at UPenn has identified 6 predictable thinking traps: mind reading, them, me, defectiveness, catastrophizing, and helplessness. Through my experience attending, designing, and facilitating diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism trainings, is that they steer human thinking towards these 6 thinking traps, regardless of identity markers, and overall steer general human thinking through that lens of fear and judgment. Remember this slide? Here it is again. The only difference is a change in title. All human beings are hardwired for the capacities for prejudice, aggression, and cruelty because these are primitive survival purposes. Present-day institutions and organizations embracing status quo, diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism teachings and practices are psychologically cultivating these traits within each individual. Therefore, we are building systems that dehumanize each other. And continuing these practices will put human beings at perpetual odds with each other for the sake of eroding their own sovereignty, unless we change course of action soon. Working with diverse groups. Anytime there are more than 2 people in a room, there is a diverse group. The more people added to the group and the more time the group spends together, the likelihood of conflict increases. The way diverse groups minimize and mitigate conflict and chaos is to adopt and work within a set of shared values, understanding of those values, and practices. Since the clashing worldviews is the cause of much of present-day human division, a strategy working groups, schools, and organizations can employ is determining their agreed-upon position regarding the individual. For groups that deem the individual as the source of injustice, the source of racism and bigotry, then status quo, diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism frameworks will work for them. For diverse groups that deem the individual as having worth and value, then empowered humanity theory is a framework worth exploring. Empowered humanity theory is a set of 6 attitudes and practices purpose for cultivating humankind's most benevolent qualities, motivations, and traits, while mitigating the barbaric and those that build walls of indignity. Neuroplasticity demonstrates that we become what we practice on a neurological level. Therefore, integrating empowered humanity theory into personal traits, relationship interactions, and societal structures will empower humanity in the profound ways most people seek. While studying the historical intent and present-day impact of the successor ideology, I also began curating and developing a set of attitudes and practices that prevent racism and bigotry and increase our overall sense of well being and belonging at the neurological level. Since the human brain is wired to accept the culture that's placed on it, it appears the newly imposed ideology will colonize the classical liberal Enlightenment era because SEL, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism reaches the individual ages pre-K all the way through retirement age and influence national and local policies. The colonization of the Enlightenment era could be thwarted if SEL, diversity, equity and inclusion, and anti racism efforts adopt a framework with tools that are designed to decrease bigotry and hatred and increase well being and belonging. The successor ideology blames the individual for humanity's previous and present day transgressions and atrocities and believes a utopia will emerge once sovereignty is conquered. Empowered humanity theory is designed to cultivate what is best within us so that we can increase our potential, the potential of others, our sense of well being, and relationships in order to mitigate prejudice, aggression, and cruelty so that we can thrive and connect in profound ways. Empowered Pathways provides tailored, experiential professional learning for schools, businesses, and organizations to integrate empowered humanity theory into their interpersonal, behavioral, and interactional habits, as well as their systems and structures. Think of these 6 attitudes and practices as a framework for navigating daily life and a framework for designing a truly empowering and inclusive working environments. The 3 attitudes are establishing a value centered identity, a dignity lens, mindsets of inquiry and compassion. And the 3 pathways of practice to strengthen those attitudes are practices which build awareness and equanimity, practices which celebrate our common humanity and break the walls of indignity, and practices which build kindness and compassion for self and others. Links and descriptions to these can be found under the Empowered Humanity Theory tab at empoweredpathways.org. Successor ideology bases one's identity on the stereotypes of their immutable traits. Empowered humanity theory promotes individuals adopt a value-centered identity. That is, identify core values that guide their thinking and behaviors. Aligning personal thoughts and behaviors with self-selected values is also an effective strategy to keep one grounded in a world where it seems difficult to find one's footing. In consulting with working groups and teams, we identified shared values and develop a shared understanding of them, and those become the principles that guide the group's work moving forward. With self-selected core values as a compass, there's a level of self-accountability not provided for by the successor ideology-based DEI theory and practice. For example, we can ask ourselves repeatedly, in this moment, is my thinking aligned with my core values and my core self? In this moment, are my behaviors aligned with my core values in myself? If not, where and how can I shift? The second attitude of empowered humanity theory is developing a dignity lens. As soon as you place anyone outside of the circle of us, the mind and brain automatically begins to devalue that person and justify treating them poorly. Feeling unheard, unseen, and even a sense of unworthiness are feelings nobody wants to experience, yet everyone has. These feelings tend to manifest in behaviors that are not in the best interest of the individual or society. Researcher and author Donna Hicks attributes these behaviors to dignity violations. Being treated as unworthy or less than violates one's dignity. Hicks' research explains how dignity violations are the root cause of all harm. Therefore, with a deep understanding and practice of honoring dignity, we can repair current and prevent future harms and injustice. Understanding dignity requires the distinction between the human and the being. Human describes the combination of a person's biological makeup and outward personality. The being is the interpersonality, and all beings share the same characteristics. The essence of all beings share the desire to avoid suffering and alleviate the suffering of others when encountered. Honoring dignity means seeing beyond even the undesirable and disrespectful behaviors and accepting the inherent worth and vulnerability of the human and knowing beneath that the person shares the same desires as you. The desire to be free of suffering and will alleviate the suffering of others when encountered. By navigating life through a dignity lens, we recognize that to the core, all human beings long for connectedness and an ease of suffering. Honoring the dignity of self and others increases personal well being and elevates all human potential. Keep in mind psychologist and author Rick Hanson's words. Pay attention to the number of times you categorize someone as not like me, particularly in subtle ways. Not my background, not my style, and so on. It's startling how routine it is. See what happens to your mind when you consciously release this distinction and focus instead on what you have in common with that person, on what makes you both an us. The third attitude of empowered humanity theory is prioritizing mindsets of inquiry and compassion above mindsets of fear and judgment. Successor ideology based DEI and antiracism theory and practices are based on thought responses of fear and judgment, and as a result, people are disconnecting from themselves and disconnecting from each other, thinking the worst about themselves and thinking the worst about each other as well. A unique survival feature of the human brain is its efficiency and ability to instantaneously categorize input based on prior experiences. This efficiency results in filling in the gaps and creating storylines that may or may not be true. This allows us to make both accurate predictions and false statements. Over time, we create narratives about ourselves, others, current situations, and beliefs about the future. When our narratives go unnoticed, they can not only limit the individual, but perpetuate the perils of harm and indignity. By noticing the narrative, we can ask ourselves, what is true? How do I know it's true? And check the narrative when needed. Sometimes it may be necessary to say to someone, the story in my head is this. Can you help me better make sense of what is going on? Mindsets are our attitudes towards experiences, people, and outcomes. And mindset research indicates the way we perceive ourselves and challenges impact the way we learn and persevere. Throughout a lifetime, we develop certain truths, which are often rooted in judgments and assumptions based on our experiences and perceptions. The accumulation of our perceptions forms a personal narrative which dictate how we interact within ourselves and how we respond to the people and experiences of our outer worlds. Our narratives have the potential to inspire growth or to lead to violence, injustice, and societal ills of modern society. Responding to challenging experiences and people with openness and curiosity is not always easy. Mindset can be influenced by the instinctual survival fear driven by activity in the amygdala, resulting in the physical and emotional discomfort we experience during challenging experiences. While these reactions may keep us safe and alive, they also limit our individual and collective potential. When left unchecked, they can develop into maladaptive defense mechanisms. It is helpful to interpret the discomfort we feel during these challenging times as the manifestation of new or rarely traveled neurological pathways being strengthened. Once we notice the narrative we tell ourselves, we can disrupt primitive subconscious reactions and respond in ways of our choosing. By pausing, breathing, and noticing, we can choose to avoid the pathways which hinder personal growth and invest our attention in building those which best serve us and our community. Mindsets have the potential to result in behaviors ranging from bias based judgments and self criticism to compassion for self and others, and curiosity. By noticing the narrative, we can reframe our experience and investigate with curiosity and compassion rather than judgment and doubt. Rick Hansen also states what flows through your mind sculpts your brain. Thus, you can use your mind to change your brain for the better, which will benefit your whole being and every other person whose life you touch. The three pathways of practice are strategies to cultivate the attitudes of a value centered identity, prioritizing mindsets of inquiry and compassion, and a dignity lens. The three pathways of practice are strategies to cultivate the attitudes of a value centered identity, prioritizing mindsets of inquiry and compassion, and a dignity lens. Are practices which build awareness and equanimity, practices which celebrate our common humanity and break the walls of indignity, and practices which build kindness and compassion for self and others. With awareness comes choice, and time spent in reflection, contemplation, and meditation reveals more choices and provides a space for us to choose with intention and focus. Viktor Frankl famously stated, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." Practices that build awareness and equanimity create a bigger space for us to choose our response. This is because these practices thicken our corpus callosum, which integrates the brain's right and left hemisphere. The corpus callosum is a bundle of nerve fibers in our brain that connect the right and left hemisphere of the brain. This enables the two hemispheres to better communicate with each other. When a particular hemisphere becomes too dominant, our lives feel either too chaotic or too rigid. Therefore, incorporating practices that build awareness and equanimity into daily routines shape our brains in ways that make our lives feel more balanced. These practices can be simple moments or extended periods of time. They cost nothing and can be done anywhere. For example, stop what you're doing and just take a brief pause. Now, slowly inhale through your nose to the count of 4 and notice the sensation of your breath as it enters your body. Hold for a brief moment and slowly exhale to the count of 8, noticing the sensation of your breath as it leaves your lungs. That's just one quick example. Another practice to build awareness is our intention setting framework we call the PATH. There are around 100 billion neurons in the adult human brain. The gaps between those neurons are called synapses. And by adulthood, there are between 100 and 500 trillion synapses. And learning occurs when a neuron's electrical energy extends across the synapse and connects to another neuron. As humans, we form and develop neural connections and pathways due to our experiences and interpretations of those experiences. Therefore, the skills, attitudes, and mindsets we practice over and over are the ones that we develop and strengthen, essentially making us who we are on a neurological level. Neuroplasticity demonstrates how the brain continues to grow, change, and form new neural connections throughout our lifetime. Therefore, we can learn and develop new skills, attitudes, and mindsets across that lifetime. With set intention, effort, relationships, and reflection, we can develop the skills and mindsets of our choosing. The pathway is a framework template purposed for guiding this development. The next pathway of practice to cultivate a value centered identity and mindsets of inquiry and compassion and a dignity lens is practices that build kindness and compassion for self and others. Acts of kindness are large, small, planned, and spontaneous demonstrations of selflessness that can transform individual hearts and minds while connecting communities through empathy and cooperation. Acts of kindness are win-win opportunities. That is, they benefit the recipient of the act, and the person that extended kindness gets a healthy dose of dopamine as well. Just as we are wired for capacities of prejudice, aggression, and cruelty for survival, we are also wired for compassion, which too is a survival feature. I think of compassion as extending kindness to relieve a moment or period of suffering. Just as our experience brings us periods of joy, they also bring periods of suffering, and practices that build kindness and compassion for self and others can proactively thwart suffering and alleviate it when it arises. Linked to older mammalian systems in the brain related to caregiving, which involves the release of oxytocin and feelings of secure attachment, practicing self compassion strengthens neural pathways responsible for love, affiliation, and an individual's capacity for emotional awareness, empathy, motivation, and social engagement. Like our breath, the ability to be kind and compassionate is always with us and doesn't cost a thing but awareness and intention. How many times in a day can you engage in a practice that builds kindness and compassion for self and others in ways that are meaningful to you? The more we engage in these practices, the more kind and compassionate we become at a neurological level. The final pathway of practice to cultivate a value centered identity, those mindsets of inquiry and compassion, and a dignity lens is practices that celebrate our common humanity. As soon as you place anyone outside of that circle of us, the mind and brain automatically begins to devalue that person and justifies treating them poorly. Successor ideology emphasizes placing people that don't look like us or think like us on the outside. This is how it is cultivating those human capacities for prejudice, aggression, and cruelty. Othering is done in the most simplest, mundane ways. We don't need help by highlighting those differences and putting those differences in competition with each other over power and resources over our immutable traits. Once again, Rick Hansen states, pay attention to the number of times a day you categorize someone as not like me, particularly in the subtle ways, not my social background, not my style, and so on. It's startling how routine it is. See what happens to your mind when you consciously release this distinction and focus instead on what you have in common with that person, on what makes you both an us. Sharing our stories with each other and finding ourselves in those stories, along with finding other shared habits, shared beliefs, and shared interest, build psychological systems that prevent us from harming each other. Just like our breaths and those acts of kindness and compassion, connecting with each other only costs awareness and intention. How many times in a day can you engage in practices that celebrate our common humanity in ways that are meaningful to you? Thinking about how we become what we practice at the neurological level, wittingly or unwittingly, what will society look like in 1, 2, 5, 25, 100 years if all the citizenry are practicing being nihilistic, cynical, devaluing each other for the sake of assuming stereotyped identities, working towards equal life outcomes for all, and excluding everyone that doesn't think along these lines? Now, on the contrary, where would humanity be in these same time frames if they abandoned successor ideology based DEI, SEL, and antiracism and adopted empowered humanity theory instead? I spend a lot of time wondering about this and finding ways to actualize it. If you too wonder how the world would look if we prioritized our shared humanity rather than our differences, I hope we can connect and actualize our shared vision together. With gratitude, Jason and the entire Empowered Pathways team.